Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I am taking part in an original tag from the wonderful Fraser Simons over at Springboard Thought. So this is a sort of food and sort of palette based tag, and I really love the idea of this. It's really sort of creative and clever, and these are quite exciting prompts that I'm hoping, from sort of what I've been looking at for it and thinking about for my choices, does sort of require you to go a little bit deeper into some sort of topic. So really excited about this, and sort of as a side point, just check out Fraser, he's great. Just do that now. But let's get started and go through these. And apologies, I will have to sort of look here and kind of squint a little bit because I've got a lot of light coming in this room. So I've had to put some books in front of, like on the side of my computer to kind of block out the sun at the right time for my phone. But then in doing so, I've also blocked out most of my screen. I mean, curtains apparently would be a helpful thing here, but there we go. So anyway, the first part of this book palette tag is the prompt sweet. What is a book that made you excited to read more by that author? And I sometimes, you know, as you may be able to tell, I often get very excited about things. And so sometimes I'll read an author and just be like, this book is incredible. I now need to go and read absolutely everything by them, which is probably a bit intense and doesn't always work. But where that's worked really well for me sometimes has been certain authors. So I knew I'd have to read Iris Murdoch. You knew this was coming. I knew I had to read more Iris Murdoch for the Booker Prize. She was shortlisted 6 times. It was gonna happen. But I read The Black Prince by her and was so blown away by how funny and clever that book was that I was like, oh yeah, maybe have to go and read more of her. And the same, oh, pardon me, the same for other authors. There are some really exciting authors who, some of them are quite new, so it's kind of difficult because there aren't necessarily as many new books to sort of check out of theirs, or other books. But for example, Anouk Arapragasam, who was shortlisted for the Booker Prize for A Passage North, I went back and read his first book, A Story of a Brief Marriage, which I just thought was really powerful and incredible. Also dealing with the Sri Lankan war, also dealing with a lot of the same themes of loss and memory and belonging and family. But I just thought does it in such an interesting way. It's so clever. It's such an interesting book. So that is another one. I would also say that there are some other authors who I'm really excited about for their next book. So for example, Douglas Stewart, I really love Shuggie Bain. He's got a new book out, Young Mungo, in April, I believe. There are also a few other authors. So Raven Leilani, I loved Luster. I'm really excited to see more from her. I think she's going to be a really exciting new voice. And just, yeah, there are lots of really great books coming out all the time. I think it's it almost feels like a fool's game sometimes with reading, because it's never ending, this pile. You know, every year, way more incredible books come out than you could ever possibly read, even just within that year. Never mind catching up on all the old ones from other times. So it's always difficult, but that's really exciting because it means that there's always somewhere new to go and some new perspective or new voice to listen to. Next up is sour. What book did you initially dislike, but after a reread you reversed your opinion on, or vice versa, where you loved something and then reread it later and didn't really get on with it? So for me, the book that comes to mind for this is Mrs. Dalloway. So the first time I read it, I had to read it for uni, and I read it and I didn't dislike it necessarily. I was kind of just a bit lukewarm about it, which feels like I'm being a heathen now. But I sort of was just like, okay, cool. And then because I'd read that quite a few months before, like a few months before I went to uni, and then it got near to the seminar, I was like, oh, I should probably reread it. And I read it again, I just thought, ooh, this book's really cool. Like, there's a lot more here that I kind of missed the first time and I'm finding really exciting. Then I had kind of a few lectures and seminars about the book, and that helped me to sort of really get like a sort of a deeper feeling about the book and sort of some other parts that I enjoyed even more. And then I sort of didn't necessarily think about it too much for a few years, but then I was living abroad and I came across a copy of The Hours, and I was like, you know what, before I read The Hours, I'm gonna reread Mrs. Dalloway. And I went and reread that book. So the third time I read it, I just was blown away by it and was absolutely in love. And I get that for some people that's totally fine. Like, it's totally fine if you firstly just don't like Mrs. Dalloway overall. totally understandable. But also, I can understand the perspective of people saying, well, if it takes you 3 times to listen to a book, to read a book, to really love it, is it really that great? I think there are a lot of books where the fact that they make you mine through and really try is a really important part of that book. I saw someone phrase it once as sort of, you know, you wouldn't expect to listen to a song or an album and get everything about it the first time. I do think books are different because you do spend a lot more time with an individual book than you might do with an album in some ways, or the kind of, the process is a little bit more involved in some ways, right? So I get that sometimes, you know, you want to sort of be able to get it on the first try or maybe the second, but that's sort of something I feel, yeah, it's just really special about Mrs. Dalloway, that it's a book that just keeps on giving more. And I think Orlando by her is a book that I've read twice, because I read it and then I wrote an essay about it and sort of reread it as part of that. And the process of rereading it and writing about it made me just sort of take such a critical look at the book and love it even more. So I just think it's brilliant to kind of do that with books, and I really like this prompt to kind of get thinking about that kind of experience. The next up is Bitter. What is a book that you feel is underrated, attacked unjustly by popular or mainstream opinion, or is simply misunderstood in some way? This is a tricky one in some ways. There are a couple of books that come to mind. First of all, again, no surprise, Ducks Newburyport. It's sort of both loved and loathed in sort of fairly equal measure. I think for me, it's a book I adore, and I don't think it's necessarily unjustly attacked. I don't think that's the right thing. I think it's, I get that it's a very Marmite kind of book. I get that a lot of people just sort of have sort of very valid criticisms of it. For me, it worked on such a sort of head and heart level. I was really blown away by the kind of the writerly nature of this book, of the kind of the clever things it does behind the scenes. But I was also really impressed by how it made me feel, which I think is an incredible feat for a book that is 1,000 pages and 1 sentence and all inner thoughts and involves like a tiger, cougar creature thing. I found it really profoundly moving, and I think that's an aspect that actually doesn't get spoken about much with the book. I think people are often kind of, a lot of the reaction to it is kind of like, huh, clever, yes, clever. And it is that, I think. But I actually think that there's a lot of heart to that book as well. So much so that, without giving a spoiler, which is 700 pages in, there is a moment around 700, 800 pages in, which is, I found really profoundly shocking. And part of the reason it was so shocking is because you've had this build-up of 700 or 800 pages to get to that point, so that when it hits, I felt the floor sort of dropping beneath me. It was such a visceral reaction that I had, and such a physical reaction that I had to the book. And so I think that's a thing that doesn't necessarily get spoken about too much. And I think it's easy to be like, oh, it's like a, you know, 1 sentence, like pretentious, whatever thing. And I get why people feel that, but I think, yeah, that's my feeling. That's the hill I will die on. So there we go. The next prompt is Salty. What is a book that changed how you thought about or related to other people, or that made you realise something about yourself that you were not aware of previously? And the book that I think makes the most sense for me on this is Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. And this is a book that I sort of didn't really know too much going into. And I sort of read it as part of like a book club with a few friends. And what was really interesting about this for me was this book is not really going to let you off the hook. So, you know, it's probably quite easy to read other books or articles or whatever, engage with a lot of other media that talks about anti-racism and a few other things. This book kind of is always one step ahead of you, so it'll sort of set you a task and makes you do the work. It's sort of a 30-day thing. And what's really interesting about it is it'll say things in the book that will kind of expose you in a way that I think is really quite profound, and it's uncomfortable. It's work, you know. And so the book will, for example, sort of say like, write these sorts of things down, and then it'll sort of really make you sort of take a good hard look at yourself. And I think it's a really powerful book for that reason. You can see that Layla F. Saad clearly has done a lot of sort of leading of sessions and workshops and all those sorts of things, and has really spent a lot of time engaging with how people would think about some of this material or some of these concepts or ideas, and has sort of therefore kind of put together a game plan of actually it's quite easy for someone to be like, yep, done the reading, all good, not a racist anymore, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And she actually sort of does sort of sit down with you and be like, okay, actually, I'm going to need you to unpack that a little bit more. I'm going to need you to do a little bit more sort of thinking and inner sort of soul searching about some of these answers. It's uncomfortable, but it's really well done. And I think it's a book that I'm really glad I read, and I sort of want to sort of push in front of more people. I think likewise, The Transgender Issue by Sean Fay is a book that I think is really clever, because the whole book is sort of, you know, a lot of books by trans people necessarily are sort of memoirs and sort of are talking to other trans people about their experiences, and sort of helping build community in that way. And that's really important, that's really powerful. But I think what The Transgender Issue does that's so powerful is it talks directly to a non-trans audience and basically says, I'm going to need you to engage with some of these things. I'm going to need you to think about this. And yes, again, some of this is uncomfortable. Some of this requires you to change some of your approaches or to sort of stand up and be a better ally. But let's think about this and let's do this seriously. So I really highly recommend both of those books, and also just really love this prompt in the sense of, I think a lot of books should make you a bit uncomfortable when they're discussing sort of certain things, to kind of help you wrangle with some issues and sort of some concepts. And then finally, there are a couple of optional prompts as part of this about different parts of your palette. And for me, I love this. I think this is really exciting. But the two I'm going to pick are the unrefined and the maturing palette. Take of that what you will. I mean, especially as in real life, I eat like a child. I sort of, if there's something that can be sort of in like, that can be basically potato, or like basically it can be in breadcrumbs, or can be like a potato shape of some form that's then like fried or like baked. I'm here for it. So anyway, my palette in terms of eating is not the best, but in terms of books, I like to think it's slightly different-ish, not really. So the unrefined palette. This is, what is a book or genre that you consider a guilty pleasure, although you shouldn't feel guilty about reading anything, hopefully, but we all know what Fraser means here. So as much as, yeah, I don't sort of necessarily see some of these things as guilty pleasures, I do, because I think I unintentionally put a lot of books in front of myself that are very like heavy and deal with big topics and like, you know, capital I issues. And as a result, it can feel quite intense to sort of be like, oh, great, I've got, you know, another few shortlisted books to go through here or whatever. I think sometimes I do sort of just quite enjoy being able to sort of just read something a little bit more charming and relaxing. So whether that's sort of like a sort of a nice kind of, again, quote unquote, easy kind of graphic novel, and not, some of them are, again, also very challenging, but, you know, sort of something like that. Or, you know, like young adult occasionally, that is all good by me as well. But I think what I normally find I do in sort of my guilty pleasures is I love reading like books that are kind of trashy and know it. So for example, I am still a massive fan of the My Dad Wrote a Porno series, because they are absurd. And like, there's nothing more pleasurable than like, I can't really be bothered to read, but here's a podcast that people talk it, like reading out this wonderfully dire book with the worst descriptions possible, and I love it. And it's everything I need. It's all the kind of camp silliness that I want in my life. And finally, a maturing palette to kind of balance that out. What is a genre that you've read little or none of but would like to sample more? And what book, if any, prompted this? So sci-fi and fantasy are genres that I really have not spent that much time with, but I'm always sort of skirting around the edge. So I, for example, love Terry Pratchett. And then there are a few other books that have sort of dabbled is the wrong word. And again, genres are so blurred and nobody really ever seems to agree on them. But for example, there are some books recently that I've read that seem to take a step into some of these genres. So for example, something like Piranesi, which, you know, has some sort of fantasy elements. So some of those books I would say are sort of reasons why I want to read a bit more sci-fi and fantasy. Also, just generally knowing Larry, Larry has opinions of being friends with him, has meant that, for example, I have read Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, although I actually sort of discovered it sort of semi-independently from him, but as a result, I've sort of read it and then have been able to sort of talk to him about it. And it's a book that I really strongly enjoyed, even though it sort of has slightly more sort of maybe sci-fi thriller elements, I guess, to it. Again, I don't really know how to sort of typify it and sort of what genre to classify it as, but also a book that I've not yet read but very much intend to, again because of Larry, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Larry's review on this is brilliant, the thumbnail is terrifying, all good, and as a result it's a book that I really want to check out. I love the way he describes it, but it also sounds like it's the sort of right kind of gateway drug for me, in that sense of it being a book that still sort of appeals to some of the kind of discussions and issues that I really like in books, in terms of gender, for example, and sort of in terms of like how a society is structured, but also just sort of is, you know, has slightly more sort of fantastical sort of sci-fi elements to it. So that's something that I'm really keen to check out. Anyway, those are my answers to this, and now I need to tag some people. So I would like to tag Larry, given that I've just been babbling about him, as always. There we go. I'd also really love to tag AJ Dunn, Reads and Writes. I'd love to hear their thoughts on this. They have such a wide, eclectic range of books that they read, so really keen to hear those. I would also really like to hear what Gunpowder Fiction and Plot would have to say about this, because again, I think they'd have some really thoughtful and really interesting ideas. And yeah, let's leave that there. I've been Bob. Here's me wittering, as usual. Hurrah! Take care, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on these in the comments, and just sort of generally hope everyone's doing well. I've been Bob. Take care. Bye-bye.